Welcome back everyone. Today we're making a flat backpack. And this is a super unique shaped bag, but it's also very useful. This is a great bag for everyday use or even just the essentials like your wallet, keys, and phone. And the cool thing about this bag is that it folds to close and you can open it up if you need more storage. This project is on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following this step-by-step tutorial. And I'm gonna be going into detail on the steps so that way nobody gets left behind. And with all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're going to want to grab yourself 1.5 yards for your main fabric, and I recommend grabbing a vinyl, a very thin leather, or a canvas. This bag has a unique structure, so heavier weight materials really pop it out and make it look nice. And I'm going to be using a full leather that's pretty much just a vinyl. It's on the medium weight side, and you can tell because it's kind of floppy, it's not too structurally sound, but it will work perfect for this bag. And that's kind of the ballpark you're looking for, so it's gonna work perfect for this bag. You'll need 3/4 yards for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be a lining. I recommend getting a lightweight twill, cotton, broadcloth, or anything along those lines. This will be on the inside of the bag and also for the inside pocket. And since you are using a heavier weight material for the main fabric, you definitely want this material to be on the lightweight side. You'll need 2 zippers, one 7-inch and one 14-inch, and feel free to use plastic or metal zippers. Pretty much any zipper works with this pattern. You can even cut your zippers off a roll, but I'm gonna actually be using precise zippers because we're gonna be doing a welt pocket, and it's a little bit easier to work with a precise zipper doing these pockets. You'll need 3 D-rings, and the size of this will vary on the option you choose. If you choose to make your strap, use a leather strap, or use a webbing strap. I'm gonna be using 3/4, so whatever size you choose, just make sure you match it up with the width of your strap, and we'll get more into this later on. Going along with the D-rings, you're gonna need 2 lobster clasps, and these are gonna be the same width as your D-rings. And I'm gonna be using 3/4 inch all the way around. You'll need 2 magnetic snap buttons, and I highly recommend using magnetic for this bag. It's so much easier to use, it's very satisfying just to clip it and fold it shut, and they're also very easy to install. You'll need 1 to 2 yards of webbing, and this is optional for the strap. You can go the webbing route or you can go the leather route. And lastly, you can actually make your strap out of the same material you're using for the bag. And I'll get into all these steps later on, so if you want to skip ahead to see how much you'll need of that particular material, you can go ahead and do that. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you start taping it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best outcome. And from here, we're gonna cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting, you should end up with 3 D-ring strap panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 strap panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 inside pocket lining panel cut out of your secondary fabric, 2 pocket flat panels cut out of your main fabric, and lastly 2 main panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your secondary fabric. Moving on to construction, we're going to start with our main panels, and we only need the main fabric, so put the secondary fabric off to the side and we're going to trace out our pockets. It's best to mark the entire pocket, and then from here we're going to cut out the slash guide in the center of the pocket. So we'll be cutting that center line and then the diagonal lines leading up to the corners. Be sure to keep the cut within the pocket marking. Grab your inside pocket lining panel and repeat this step. Trace out the pocket using the pattern and then cut the slash guide in the center of the pocket. And try to make this identical as possible to your first pocket. Grab the main panel and your inside pocket lining panel, place the right sides together, lining up the pockets. With the pockets perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch around the outside edge directly on our marking. And when you come to those corners, make sure you stay on the outside of your diagonal cuts. After finishing up the stitch, make sure the corners are perfectly square. If so, then we're going to push the pocket lining into the main panel so the right sides are out. Line up the edges around the opening of the pocket. If you're using a fabric that can be pressed, I highly recommend pressing around that outside edge. Grab your 7-inch zipper, and before we actually apply this, we're going to do a whip stitch at the top, so pull the zipper back just a little bit and stitch the 2 sides together at the top of the zipper. And basically this is just a back and forth tack stitch. Next, go back to the pocket opening on our main panel, and we're going to place that zipper on the wrong side of our main fabric in the center of that pocket opening. The right side of the zipper will be touching the right side of the secondary fabric. Line up the zipper train directly with the outside edge, and the back of the zipper will be hanging off the edge just a little bit. Once you get that perfectly lined up, pin it into position and stitch all the way around the outside edge on the right side of the fabric. So this technically will be a top stitch. Definitely take your time with the stitch. You want the stitch to be as neat as possible because it will be front and center of your bag. Another quick tip, when it comes to marking out these pockets, using a marker is not the best idea because you can still see it after you're done sewing. So use something you can wipe off the fabric. Another quick detail you can add on is leather or vinyl caps on the zipper ends. This is simply done by cutting the leather or vinyl to the shape of your desire, placing it over both ends of the zipper, overlapping the zipper just a little bit and stitching it down. Next, we're going to flip to the wrong side of the main panel and trim the zipper end as close as we can to the top stitch. You mainly want to make sure you have enough room on the side to add a stitch. That being said, we're going to fold that pocket in the center so the right sides are together. Line up the side and top edges. Make sure the top edge of the pocket and the main fabric are separated, and we're going to stitch the sides in the top edge, and I'm actually going to be using a serger. Feel free to use a serger or a regular straight stitch. I'm using a serger to prevent future fraying. Flip the main panel back to the right side, and using the pattern, we're going to mark out the strap placement on the bottom edge of our main panel. Make sure the pattern is perfectly lined up because this is where the straps are going to be going, and you want it to be centered as possible. After marking the straps, we're going to move up and mark the placement for our magnetic buttons. You should have two markings, one towards the top center and one towards the right side of our main panel. And lastly, we're going to place the pattern down and grab our 14-inch zipper. And we're going to be doing the same thing to this zipper by adding the whip stitch at the top of the zipper. Go back to the main panel and find the zipper placement on the top left edge. You're going to be placing that zipper on the inside of the corner notch, and the zipper track should fall just short of the center. So to be clear, the zipper train should be flush with the inside edge of that corner notch. And make sure the right sides are together. Then we're going to grab our secondary fabric, place it over top, sandwiching that zipper in between the main fabric and the lining. Line up both of the panels perfectly, and I highly recommend throwing a few pins in so nothing moves around. After adding a couple pins, make sure you move the inside pocket out of the way of your stitch. And we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that zipper, and make sure you stop at the zipper end. I like to place my pin at my stop point. I find that's an easy and effective way to know where to stop the stitch. After finishing up the stitch, just double check to make sure you did not sew that pocket in with that top edge. Flip the secondary fabric around to the back so the wrong sides are touching. Line up that top edge perfectly. With both of the layers perfectly lined up, we're going to add a top stitch. And I'm going to be using an edge presser foot. This is a great way to get consistent edge stitches throughout your project. It's just another quick tool that really brings your project to the next level. And if you are using a heavier weight material like vinyl, this stitch can be pretty tricky, so just take your time. Stitch all the way to the zipper end, and after you're done, double check to make sure both of the layers are lined up evenly. And lastly, we're going to fold the panel in half just to double check to make sure that zipper lines up correctly. Place the main panel off to the side and grab your pocket flap panel. Just like the previous steps, we're going to mark out the placement for our magnetic button. Be sure to use the panel that's the opposite way of our pattern. Place the pattern on the right side of our panel and mark out your button. Cut or punch a hole in your marking. I'm going to be using just a standard magnetic button. These are super easy to install. And for the flat panel, we're going to be using the thinner side. So if you're using the same buttons, place the thinner side through your opening and add a cap to the back end. And the nice thing about these buttons, you can secure them down using multiple methods. I'm going to be using a standard press, but feel free to use pliers, press, or even a hammer. After pressing, grab the opposite side of the flap, place the right sides together, and we're going to stitch around the outside edge and leave a gap at the top edge. Keep in mind we will be stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and going around those corners, make sure you take your time. And on that top edge, once you get a couple inches in, stop, add a nice tack stitch, jump forward about 2 to 4 inches, just enough space so you can flip the right sides back out and continue your stitch. Find the opening in that top edge and flip the right sides out. I find it's best to use something pokey and long to poke out all the corners. Before we seal off the top edge, we're going to flip it around to the right side, the opposite side of the magnet, and add a top stitch to the bottom edge. We will be using the edge presser foot again, and this stitch is going to be a little bit tricky if you are using vinyl. If you're using a standard fabric, it should be no problem. And just to stop really quick, when it comes to working with vinyls like this, it's really hard to get that perfect stitch because it's a thicker material and it's also kind of sticky. So to avoid getting that offset stitch that doesn't look consistent, you're gonna wanna get a walking foot sewing machine. This is gonna pull both sides of the fabric through at the same time on top and bottom. So you're not gonna have any hangups on top with that sticky, thick fabric. I highly recommend looking into a walking foot sewing machine. But if you don't have the room for a machine like that, you can go with the walking foot presser foot that you put on your machine, but you do have to make sure your machine is compatible. And the last option is just matching the thread with the color of your fabric. This alone will hide any imperfections. It's not gonna do the best, but it is something. And these are just a few ideas to really bring your project to that next level. I do have a walking foot sewing machine in the shop. If anyone wants to see that used in a video, I can definitely do that. But anyways, let's get back into the project. So figure out a method that works best for you and maybe find something new for the future. Hopefully this gave you a little insight on what machines to look for. So next we're gonna grab our main panel and place our flat panel, and we're gonna place it directly in the center of our zipper. And this is the 14-inch zipper on the top edge. We'll be stitching it directly to the main fabric and also sealing off the opening on the top edge. So make sure the right sides are together on that opening and the top edge is even. Line the panel up in between the zippers, and before we stitch it down, you'll want to make sure you move the lining out from behind the main fabric. And also move the top of the inside pocket out of the way. You should have a nice little gap in between the lining and the top edge of the pocket. Pin the flat panel down and add a top stitch along the top edge. And again, take your time with the stitch. There's gonna be a lot of fabric here, so you really wanna go slow and hand crank it if you need to. Flip the panel back and forth to make sure it's secured down good, and if it's looking good, we're gonna next add the opposite side of our magnet. This is easiestly done by marking where the button falls. After you marked and punched your hole, we're gonna grab the opposite side of the magnet, which should be the side that actually has the magnet. It's the side that's a little bit thicker, and we're gonna place it through our opening. Add the back cap and press it into position. After securing it down, I always like to double check to make sure that the magnet lines up. If it lines up correctly, we're going to move to the opposite side of the main panel and add our second magnetic button. We'll be using the same style button, and we're going to be putting that thinner side towards the top of the panel. So just like the previous steps, we're going to mark and punch out the holes, add the buttons, and press everything into position. So to test this one before moving on, you're going to fold the panel in half and bring the thin magnet towards the bottom of the panel to meet the opposite side. Your zipper should be close to a 45-degree angle. Moving on, we're going to attach the opposite side of the 14-inch zipper. So fold the main fabric back to line up with the zipper, right sides together, and do the same thing for the lining on the opposite side of the zipper. And the easiest thing to do is to line up the corner notches on all the layers and add a pin. After pinning, double check to make sure the side edges are perfectly lined up. Add a couple more pins along the top edge to make sure nothing moves as you're sewing. And before you start sewing, you're going to want to make sure the back end of the zipper lines up perfectly with the back center of the folded panels. Once you're satisfied everything is lined up correctly, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that zipper. After finishing off the stitch, double check both sides to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and then flip the right sides back out. If done correctly, the side and bottom edges should line up. And the next thing we have to do is add our top stitch. This one can be a little bit tricky. We're going to do the same way we did the opposite side, so line up the layers. I always like to add a few pins to make sure it's nice and even along that zipper. And once you're satisfied, go ahead and add your top stitch. And be sure to stitch right up with the end of that zipper train. Double check to make sure all the layers got sewn together. Place the panel off to the side and grab our DRing strap panels. All of these panels are going to be made the same exact way. We're going to roll the edges in a 1/4 inch, and then we're going to fold it in half to meet both of those edges. So it can be pretty tricky to get these looking perfect, but it can be done. And once you have it lined up, we're going to stitch both of the edges as close as we can to the outside edge. And that's basically it. You can change the width and the length. You just want to make sure it fits through your D-ring. And if you decide to change any bit about the width and the length, you're going to want to do the same thing for the opposite panels. The second option is using leather or webbing strips, and this is a super simple yet effective technique. Cut the strip to the finished size of your strap or to the exact size of your D-ring. So if you are using a different size D-ring, just make sure you cut it to match the width of your D-ring. Both of these techniques work great, so whatever technique you pick, make sure you cut 3 of the same size. Moving on, grab your strap panel, and the strap panel is going to be assembled the same way we did the D-ring panels. We're going to roll the outside edges in a 1/4 inch and then fold it directly in the center so the outside edges meet. Once you have the outside edges lined up and together, we're going to repeat this all the way down our strap panel. I find instead of pinning it, I like to fold it and sew it as I go. This technique is easier to me, but the easiest technique would be to actually press it, but since I'm using vinyl, it's harder to press vinyl without melting it. So if you're using a material that you can press, I highly recommend pressing it before you sew it. Once you finished up one side, we're going to move to the opposite side and do the same thing, add a stitch along the outside edge. And this is the same process we did for the D-ring panels. Same goes for the strap panel. You can also swap this out for a leather strip or webbing. And if you do decide you want the leather strip, what you're going to want to do is cut 2 strips, the same size as your strap panel, and simply place the wrong sides together and stitch along both of the side edges. Before stitching, the best thing to do is actually use a little bit of fabric or leather glue. This is going to keep both of those layers locked together, so it's way easier to stitch. When the glue is done setting, you can add your stitches. Also, feel free to add more than just side stitches. You can add decorative stitches or pretty much whatever you want. So the next quick tip is for people that are using leather and can't get the strip as long as the actual strap panel. I didn't have a big enough piece to cut the strip from, so what you're going to want to do is extend your D-ring strips. And I found extending just 2 of them, the ones you're going to use at the bottom, works perfectly and helps make up the difference in between the strap panel. But by all means, if you can cut a long enough strip, just go that route. I just wanted to provide you with an idea for this scenario. Grab the main panel assembly and find the markings at the bottom edge of your panel. Grab 2 of the D-ring panels and feel free to use the leather strips or the ones you made. And if you are using the leather strips and it turns out you're in the same scenario where you can't cut the strap as long as it should be, we're going to be adding 1 more stitch to the back end of the strap, so that way the D-ring is not flopping all around and it holds everything more into place. No need to worry about the strip if you're using the ones you made because they are shorter and they're not going to be moving around. Again, feel free to use any of the methods. I just like to provide a few different ways. So we're going to be using the leather strips and we're going to place them directly on our placement markings, and we're only going to be attaching this to the main fabric. Do the same thing for either method and stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. And this is only to hold these in place so it's easier to sew everything together in future steps. Next, we're going to stitch the side seam, so separate the main fabric from the lining and make sure the right sides are together. I think it's easiest to move the zipper train down just a little bit. We're going to be stitching this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and it's very important there's a small little gap that you sew in between the zipper and the outside edge. This is the gap you're going to be sliding your last D-ring strap panel through. But anyways, make sure that top edge is lined up perfectly, pin all the layers together, and stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I get directly to the center, I like to go back and forth and do a quick tack stitch. Make sure all the layers got stitched together and flip the right sides out. With the right sides out, we're going to look along that zipper line and make sure the back edge is lined up evenly. If everything is looking good, we're going to flip it inside out. Find the small little opening at the top of your zipper. This is essentially going to be the top of your bag, and this opening is going to be in between your zipper and your main panel. Grab your last D-ring panel, and again, feel free to use the ones you made, leather strips or webbing. It's all going to be done the same way. We're going to slide it in from the inside to the outside, making sure you leave a little bit of that strap end on the inside of the bag. And from here, we're going to stitch directly on top of the zipper and do the same thing for the opposite side of the zipper just to clean it up a little bit and get rid of that gap. And the key thing to remember here is to make sure that zipper is sitting flat as you're sewing. And repeat this technique for the opposite side of the zipper. Once you've finished up the stitch, flip the D-ring out to make sure the wrong sides are touching and all the layers are stitched together. Trim up the extra material on the inside so it's flush with the zipper. Next, we're going to lay the bag out flat with the main fabric and secondary fabric separated. And what we're going to do is move that side seam directly into the center of the panel. So the side seam will be our new center back. And this can only be done when you unzip the zipper and make sure both of the sides are lined up perfectly in the center. From here, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides, and for the lining side, we're going to leave a small gap just like we did in the pocket flat panel. Sew directly over the D-ring strap panels, and then for the opposite side, again, we're going to leave that gap about 2 to 4 inches. Find that opening after you're done sewing, and we're going to pull the entire bag out through that opening. The bigger the opening, the easier it is to pull the bag through, but once you get it pulled through and both of the layers lined up, we're going to go back to that opening and seal it off the same way we did the flat panel. Fold the right sides together and add an edge stitch along that opening. This will be on the inside of the bag, so it won't be noticeable. And after sealing off the opening, we're going to flip the right sides back out, Do a quick once over, make sure all the angles are looking good and the bottom's looking even. If you're satisfied with your work, the last thing we have to do is add our strap. Grab both of your Lobster clasps, and these are the same width as my strap, and we're simply just going to add them on the ends. But before we add them on, the thing is, mine don't fit through the opening D-ring, so what you're going to want to do is actually slide your strap through the top D-ring first. If your setup fits through the D-ring, then you can totally skip this step. From here, make sure it's even on both sides. We're going to feed it through our clasp, fold it over, and add a stitch. Feel free to add a box stitch, a tack stitch, or even an X stitch. If you are using the strap you made, more than likely it's going to be a little bit thinner. So what you can do is actually fold the end over twice, giving yourself a nice clean edge, and then from there you can add your stitch. Clip your straps to the D-ring and your bag is complete. The final step is adding your branding, and I always like to add mine in areas where I can clip different things to, so definitely figure that out. And that's gonna do it for your flat bag. Hopefully you had fun with this project and yours turned out awesome. I know this is kind of a unique bag and the way it goes together is a little bit different than a traditional bag. So if yours didn't turn out great the first try, I highly recommend trying it a few more times. This bag does take practice, just like anything. But like always, if you have any questions or ideas, definitely comment or message me on my website. And until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.